welcome back to the Hannah Franklin podcast. On today's episode, instead of doing a normal interview, I want to share with you my top book recommendations. I get asked about these a lot over the past few years, going deep down the rabbit hole of education. I've read a ton of books. I have stacks of them on the shelves behind me. But there are a couple handfuls of books that I very frequently recommend. You may have seen me write Twitter threads about these before. They're the books that I most often gift to parents. And if a parent were to come to me who is either thinking about homeschooling or unschooling their kid, or maybe they were trying to figure out what school would be the best fit for them, or maybe they just wanted to do more research so that they could be the best possible steward of their child's learning experience, even if they were taking a more traditional path, these would be the books that I would recommend. They're the books that have been most influential in my own thinking. And it's the stack that I think is most helpful for really understanding how to take charge and facilitate your child's education experience. So we have a whole stack of books that we're going to talk about today. And the one I want to start with is the one I think is the most important. I know you're supposed to save this for last, but if I were to recommend one book out of this whole list to read that I didn't want you to miss, this would be it. It's the book that I gift the most often to parents. It's called Don't Tell Me I Can't by Cole Summers. If you missed the story of Cole Summers, I would highly recommend going down this rabbit hole, because this, more than anything else, will fundamentally change how you think about what is possible in a child's education. Cole, his real name was Kevin Cooper, wrote under the pseudonym Cole Summers, was a 14-year-old rancher living in a desert valley in southwest Utah. He was the child of two disabled parents. His older brother was autistic. He had been homeschooled and effectively unschooled since he was a child. He started from kindergarten on up with a very self-directed unschooling journey. And when he was 9 years old, he purchased a 350-acre ranch entirely by himself. When he was 10 years old, he bought and flipped a house. He had purchased and financed his own tractor. He had his own truck, and he was building this very complicated business plan to build a profitable agriculture business that could then funnel its profits into the regenerative agriculture and ecological projects that he was really interested in, saving the desert ecosystems of southwest Utah. He wrote this autobiography at age 14 to tell his story because he knew he'd had a very unusual education, and he was working on building his personal brand and his audience on primarily Twitter, which is where I first encountered him and his work. And this book is amazing. It tells the story of his education experience, some of the most important highlights along the way, the philosophy and approach that his parents took in educating him. And hearing a teenager talk about how when he was an elementary schooler, he started purchasing properties is a pretty mind-blowing experience for someone who maybe hasn't had a ton of exposure to homeschooling. And even if you have, it's a crazy story. And I think this is a must-read for every parent because it will fundamentally shift what you think is possible and the Overton window through which you are thinking about the education of your children and the possibilities for that education and what your children are capable of. The next book I would recommend is The Intellectual Lives of Children by Susan Engel. This book was recommended to me by Eric Daniels, a professor at Clemson University and a former Montessori school teacher who I had on the podcast a couple months back. Highly recommend listening to that episode. It's very good. This book is such a great peeling back of the curtain of what happens inside the mind of a child as they developed their intellect. It talks about the ways in which a child begins to develop their capacity to synthesize ideas, to notice patterns, and it gives you a behind-the-scenes lens of what's happening when a child does very stereotypical things like ask why all the time as a 2- and 3-year-old. And when they start to develop their first obsession, things like trucks or dinosaurs, or maybe big life questions like marriage or death, what's happening in their minds when they start to repeatedly come back to a topic they find interesting. And it explains why these very stereotypical developmental milestones that we all know about are actually critical for the child's ability to organize and make sense of very complex and disparate pieces of information that they're interacting with over the course of time. This book is fascinating. It completely changed the way that I think about how kids' brains work and what I'm observing when I'm interacting, especially with small children. And I would highly recommend reading. It's told primarily through the format of stories, so it's a really easy and engaging read, but it's also very information dense. Highly recommend. The next book on the list is Free to Learn by Peter Gray. I've also had Peter Gray on the podcast. Highly recommend listening to that episode. Dr. Gray is a developmental psychologist who studies the impact and the importance of play on a child's development. And this book, Free to Learn, is all about the importance of a child's instinct to play and how deeply hardwired that instinct is. It's a biological drive within us. We're hardwired to learn through mimicry and through mirroring of the adults around us when we are children. And this book explains how that instinct to play shows up in different cultures around the world and why it's so important to create an environment for your children that fosters that innate desire to play because it's so critical for their development. On the topic of development and how our children's brains actually work, The ABCs of How We Learn by Daniel Schwartz is another amazing read. It decodes what's happening in kids' brains and adults' brains when they learn new things and why some approaches to learning work and others don't. This is, in simplest terms, a book on learning science, the science of how we learn, which we have spent decades studying across all of the top academic universities in the country and the world, and yet still have barely implemented inside of traditional and public school classrooms, which is why most of us aren't very well versed in the science of how we learn, because we haven't been exposed to it. This book has 26 different learning science techniques, basically scientifically backed approaches to learning new things, things like spaced repetition and active recall, techniques that solidify new information in our brains and make it more and more accessible and more concretized for us. In a traditional public school classroom, there is very little room to implement the learning science techniques that we've discovered over the course of the past decades, because the classroom hinges on the ability for a single teacher at the front of the class to teach to 30 kids at the same time. And so there's no room to cater a child's learning experience to their particular pace and their particular needs. So, for example, with something like spaced repetition, the best thing you can do for a child to help them learn a new topic, and this applies for adults too, is to expose them to a new piece of information and have them work their way through the material and then quiz them on it and see very quickly they're actively recalling what they've learned, see how much they remember or how much they've retained. And then based on the results of that quiz, have them re-engage with a new set of material that covers the things that they missed or the things that they didn't learn in the previous session. Over time, you're re-exposing them to the same content again and again, which is what spaced repetition is. You're allowing space for your brain to partially forget what you've learned, and then you're re-accessing it to strengthen the neural pathways. But none of this is possible in a 30-person classroom with a single teacher because every child's pace is going to be different. And so every child is going to need a different set of materials to re-access based on their quiz results, which means that a teacher in a classroom could never deliver a lesson based on these principles. This is true for much of the learning science research that we've accumulated, which is why most of it doesn't get used inside of a traditional school. But these principles are things that you can use as a parent to deliver an education for your kid, which is why books like this are so powerful, because they give you the chance to understand and implement things that will give your child a huge advantage in the learning that they're doing, because they're implementing tools that are going to make them learn more effectively and, frankly, usually much more quickly. All right, the fifth book in the stack, Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Understand Math and What We Can Do About It by Andrew Bernstein. This is a great expose on what's happening inside of the classroom and why our test results across the board in America are so abysmal. The title of this book is a play on the Rudolf Fleischmann book from, I believe, the 1950s, titled Why Johnny Can't Read, which was an explanation of why our reading scores at the time were so bad. Spoiler, they haven't gotten better, they've gotten worse. And so this book is a modern day spin-off of the same question. Why can our children still not read? Why are our test scores still so bad? And what can we do about it? So the book explains effectively what's happening inside of the classroom and why it leads to such poor test results and what we're missing. As a second recommendation in parallel to this one, I don't have the copy of the book with me, but I highly, highly recommend reading a book called Mediocrity by Connor Boyack, who I've had on the show, and Corey DeAngelis, who is an advocate and evangelist for the school choice movement. The book is a summary of 40 things that are destroying public education in America. It's a compilation of statistics, of historical facts around why our education system was set up the way it is and how it has in some ways been in decline in terms of the academic results that it's been delivering. It talks about issues in funding and some of the bureaucratic strangleholds that prevent evolution and growth inside of our education system. It is perhaps the best compilation of just facts around what's happening in education that parents should know about. And it usually makes my short list of books that I recommend to parents. If I'm recommending, say, 5 books to a parent, that's almost always going to be on the list because it's just such a great summary of things that parents should know, whether or not they're sending their kids to public school or choosing to pull them out. If you want to be informed about what's happening in education in America, that is one of the most important books to read. If you want to read about good news and things that are more optimistic and more positive than how public education in America is struggling and selling our kids short, I highly recommend reading Courage to Grow by Laura Sandifer. This book tells the story of the founding of Acton Academy, which is one of the earliest networks of modern, alternative, and innovative schools. It was started in Austin, Texas, which is quite a hotbed for alternatives in education. And it just tells the story in narrative form of how Jeff and Laura Sandifer, who were parents, decided that they wanted to start a school for their kids and went on this odyssey of figuring out the bureaucratic and legal regulations of starting a school. They figured out how to find space for their school. They developed a curriculum. They enrolled students, and over time built a network of successful schools that is one of the forerunners of what an alternative school network can look like and has locations all over the world. Acton Academy is a really exciting education model. They refer to their students as not as students, but as heroes on a hero's journey, which is their education experience. There are multiple really successful school networks that have spun off of Acton Academy. Apogee Schools, started by Matt Boudreau and Tim Kennedy, who I've had on the show, is one of the most recent examples. I had Tim on the podcast a few months ago to talk about building the Apogee School network, which is started in Cedar Park, Texas, which is a little bit north of Austin, but is opening locations now all over the country. And it's a direct result of the work that Jeff and Laura Sandifer did with Acton Academy. Apogee was started as an Acton Academy before spinning off into its own thing. So Acton has been the fertile seeding ground of many of the big leaps and bounds and forward progress in the alternative school movement. And this book, Courage to Grow, is just such a great, real, raw story of the process of launching this school network. And it's a really inspiring and encouraging read. I also have to recommend this book by Clark Aldrich called Unschooling Rules. This is another really simple read. It's, about 150 pages, but they're not dense pages, as you can see. It's pretty easy to get through. But it's just a collection of 55 principles about delivering in unusual and child-centric education. So if you're interested in the idea of unschooling or of deschooling your kids, pulling them out of a traditional program, or maybe just supplementing a traditional program, this book is a really great resource because it's going to give you a really great summary of just things to think about that are maybe deeply ingrained in a traditional education experience, but are not necessarily important or even helpful for your child to be exposed to. On the topic of things that kids are exposed to in school, or that kids are learning in school that are unhelpful to them, especially the psychological assumptions about who they are and how they interact with the world, I have to recommend John Taylor Gatto. Most of my copies of Gatto's books are currently out on loan, but his books are a must read for parents. This is another one that when I'm making a top 3 or top 5 book list, his books always make the cut. The one I have here is The Underground History of American Education, but the one I would recommend starting with is called Dumbing Us Down. John Taylor Gatto was a public school teacher in New York City. He worked there for 30 years, and he won Teacher of the Year award twice, and he resigned from his job after his second time winning the award. And he penned a letter that effectively said, I need to find a new career where I feel like I'm actually helping kids and not harming them. And after quitting his job, Gatto became one of the most prominent critics of education in America. And one of the big points that he made is that kids are learning a secondary set of lessons besides their normal academic lessons. Kids in school, we think, are going and learning how to do math, how to read, how to write. They're learning about history. They're learning about science. And that's true, but there's a second set of lessons that's baked into their experience about who they are as people and how they fit into society and how they interact in large social settings. And Gatto was very critical of that. He talked about how when you're in school, one of the lessons you learn is that your self-worth is tied to a grade and it's tied to your class position. And any action that you take hinges on the permission of an authority figure like your teacher. And that's what the core of Dumbing Us Down is about. It's about these secondary lessons that our kids are learning and why they're so detrimental to our children's development. He has another great book called Weapons of Mass Instruction that I would highly recommend. Anything written by Gatto is great and will give you such a clear perspective into some of the structural failings of our education system, less from the standpoint of outcomes and more from the standpoint of what it's doing to our children's psychology. And it's coming from the perspective of someone who spent decades working in both the best and the worst schools in New York City. So he has a very scathing and undeniable perspective. He knows what he saw. He knows what the education he was delivering did to the children he worked with. And he holds no punches in terms of being really honest about what he thinks that type of education does to kids and why it's problematic. The last book on this list, and we could keep going for a while with book recommendations. I haven't talked at all yet about John Holt. I haven't talked at all about Maria Montessori. Maybe I will do another one of these at some point with a 2.0 list because there's a lot of good stuff that we haven't yet covered. But the last book I'm going to talk about here is written by my friend Michael Gibson, who I also had on the podcast about a year ago. This is another interview I would recommend. And it's called Paper Belt on Fire. And this one is much more focused on higher education, but so much of a child's education from kindergarten on up is predicated by the necessities of preparing them for higher education. So even if your child is on the younger side, this is still a book that's worth reading, because the more you start questioning the importance of higher education, or at least thinking about what you want out of your child's higher education, the more you can get creative about what you're doing in the early years. If you haven't listened to the Michael Gibson interview, Michael is a co-founder of an investment fund called 1517 that backs young people who don't have college degrees in launching companies. He helped to build the Thiel Fellowship, which is Peter Thiel's investment fund, where he pays young people $100,000 to not go to college and start a company instead, which is what 1517 was built out of. And in this book, Michael tells the story of being on the ground floor of the Thiel Fellowship and what the process was like to build it and what they learned along the way. He tells the story of launching 1517, and he writes a pretty scathing critique of why higher education in America is so broken and why it is not the path to the future, especially for our entrepreneurial and ambitious young people. Michael is an extremely talented writer and storyteller. This book is so much fun to read. I blew through it when I read it. And even if you have kids who are small, even if you don't have kids at all, I highly recommend reading it, because it's not just enlightening in terms of thinking about education. It's also super enlightening in terms of thinking about tech and innovation and the future of science and entrepreneurship in America. And it's a really insightful and a really entertaining read. Okay, that's the full stack for now. There are lots more books to talk about, so we will probably do another one of these in the future. But hopefully you found this useful. If you have book recommendations that you think I missed, that you think are important, please drop them in the chat. I would love to know which books have been most influential to you and also which books you most commonly recommend. Hopefully you find some of these books helpful. If you read some of them and find them interesting, I would love to know what you think. Please leave a comment or send me a message. And otherwise, we will be back here next week. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.